Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Migration Policy Center webinar on migration policymaking in Africa, determinants and implications for cooperation with Europe. My name is Dr. Linda Ucho, and I run an independent research think tank in Kenya called the African Migration Development Policy Center, and I recently joined the MPC as a research associate. It is my pleasure to chair this webinar discussion today, as it is a key area of interest for me and also the speakers that we have today. Today's webinar aims to focus on key issues and policy determinants on migration and mobility as a follow-up for the AU-EU Ministerial meeting in Kigali last year in October, and ahead of the 6th European Union and African Union Summit taking place next week on the 17th and 18th of February. Before I introduce the speakers, and invite them to make their intervention, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping announcements. If you wish to raise any questions, please indicate your question in the chat box on YouTube, and they'll be flagged for my attention, and I'll direct it to the relevant speaker. Today, we're actually joined with three exceptional speakers to discuss migration policies from the AU-EU lens. First, we have, I'll do an introduction of the speakers, and they'll make their intervention. First, we have Professor Mehari Maru of the MPC and School of Transnational Governance, who's a part-time professor. He'll be presenting on the migration policy making in Africa, determinants and implications for cooperation in Europe. A bit about Professor Mehari. He's a fellow at the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies. Graduate of Harvard and Oxford. He has several accolades that I cannot actually go through at this point in time. But he's an asset on migration issues in Europe and Africa, including serving as a technical committee member at the Tana High Level Security Forum, and has worked as a program coordinator at the African Union. So in order for us to get some perspectives from Mehari, I would like to invite him to make his intervention on the key area on migration policy making in Africa, looking at the relations between Africa and Europe. So, Professor Mehari, welcome to the floor.
Thank you, Linda, and good day to all of you. I just wanted to share a slide, and with that, I would like to thank MPC and my colleagues here, both Chair Linda and Maurizio and Amanda. I hope we will have a very good conversation with those that are following also on this webinar. This is a brief presentation of a research output that was published as working paper at MPC recently, and it summarizes mainly the main factors or determinants of policy making on migration in Africa. And later on, with Amanda, the other discussant, she would even complement further and refine these points that I am going to share with you. So when we say determinants, mainly, it means factors that influence, shape and change policy positions of the countries on migration. And secondly, what the implications means, the potential impacts is that these factors that are taken into consideration in the calculus of policy making by the African countries and African governments, and their impact on relationship with the European countries and the European institutions that are dealing with migration. So the first one, there are about 7 factors that I have identified. I'll go one by one with these factors. The first one is there is a commonly held view that migration and development are intrinsically linked. If you see, almost all documents that are produced by African policymakers, almost all, from the African Union to regional economic communities to member states level, there is always a narrative that comes out clearly that migration and development are related, and that both should not be separated. They should be in policy positions and common positions that the African Union has. And member states, when they raise their discussion on migration, they link it with development. And in it, you have a big assumption that actually irregular migration, as we talk about it more often since the 2015, what is called migration crisis, but previously even 2006, 2005, since the EU Commission started to engage migration with a full-fledged policy document, you will see that there is an assumption, deep-held assumption, that irregular migration is a result or an outcome of extreme poverty. By adding developmental issues, you will address, by addressing developmental issues, you will address irregular migration and migration-related vulnerabilities and challenges that are now migrants face and countries of origin, countries of transit and destination face. And so this is contested, as we know, from the different theories that we have that are being discussed. There is robust debate between my colleagues, for example, in MPC and other migration experts about the hump theory, that actually more income could encourage migration, that it is a certain level of income that it starts to decline. Otherwise, those relationship has been contested, and there are a lot of discussion that actually investment on public service, on development aid could mitigate, then reduce irregular migration indirectly by making livelihood and life in general more decent and tolerable. So there are debates, but the point I am trying to make, without making judgment on the scientific merits of both theories, is that African policymakers link migration and development as an important two faces of the same coin, that when you want to address the challenges related to migration, when they view that you have to address developmental issue, and developmental issue affects the migration patterns and frequency, direction of migration, and so on. So that is the first point I want to make. And you will see it almost everywhere in debate and discussion. The root cause approach is related to this. Many would link it to the root cause discussion. See at the, if you look at the AU common position on migration since day one, which is a reflection or an overlapping consensus of member states on their position vis-a-vis partnership on migration, you will see this coming repeatedly. The second important factor, probably more important than number one, in my opinion, is the political regime type of country, and which affects also the domestic politics. And this has incredible impact on partnership, especially, but also how migration is governed in countries. The political regime type, I mean, is whether the government is responsive to demands within the country and outside the country, demands, pressures that come. It could be from media, it could be from civil society, human rights organization, it could be from partner states or intergovernmental authorities, and so on. Now, the more democratic and human protective regime you have in Africa, the more responsive it is for migration issues in general, both partnership, but also internal pressures and pressures from the diaspora. And we have seen this one, especially on return and return readmission and reintegration, where countries are extremely, which I will come number three as a factor, where you have countries with large number of diaspora, which remits money, or you have a large number of irregular migrants, which are exposed to different kind of human rights violations, then when something happens, the reaction of the government depends how far it is amenable to public pressure. And this is a function of the democratic institutions that you have, the judicial institutions that you have, the media, robustness of the media you have. In some cases, I can give you an example, when you have a killing of irregular migrants in Libya or on other routes to Southern Africa, depending which country these migrants are coming or where this is happening, the institutions react more robustly in countries where you have more democratic dispensation. Where you have authoritarian governments, the governments actually go to agreements that do not necessarily reflect the interest of the domestic political consensus and process that you have, and they are imposed by governments. And when you have change of government, immediately there are reversals, or at least withholding cooperation, for example, with European Union or European countries. Gambia is an example, or Ethiopia is an example, where you have significant number of people being returned, for example. But one country which has a more robust democratic dispensation feels the heat of returning large number of returnees, and that impacting the decision-making of the government. But when you have authoritarian government, then the impact on the process is limited. So the policy could be dependent on the regime type. And we have seen it where countries immediately change their position once they sign in Brussels or Valletta. When they go to their capital, they cannot pursue the same kind of policies. And I discuss in detail in my paper about these examples where they cannot hold the same position they have because the pressure has mounted on them by a diaspora based, which is diaspora by definition is more empowered than the countries, economically at least, and in terms of if the diaspora comes actually from a country which is authoritarian, then the freedom the diaspora has in other countries of origin, destination, like in Europe or US, it has more leverage, more pressure on the domestic politics, even from proxy, through proxy methods, and that impacts the policy decision-making process of the country. The third, which is related to that, is financial gain, which is an incentive infrastructure, if you wish, that has been deployed by different partners, but from European Union even more often, but also bilaterally, and even with institutions, international UN institutions or other institutions, is the financial gain. And financial gain could be both development aid, project related or other type, but also remittances, large portion of remittances, which goes to family and immediately affects the livelihood of many families, and in some cases, investments of the diaspora. And remittance, by definition, is diaspora's money. And it has immediate impact when you touch that the remittance, the capacity to send remittance, it has impact. But there is another additional aspect from on remittance, even if it's individual money of the diaspora transferring the money, but it is also public. There is big public interest. It is a large source of foreign currency, hard currency, especially for countries that are facing hardship. So there is huge interest on that. Anything that affects the development aid or affects income of families from the diaspora, or that affects foreign currency income of the countries, immediately affects the policy makers and political system. So it has impact. When you return large number of migrants, for example, it has impact, especially if they are people who have been established for some time and they were starting to remit. Additional, of course, factor is diplomacy, or that is related to geographic proximity and routes to Europe. Geography plays a big role in migration. there are choke points for migration or real in channels where you have, if you hold them tight by controlling those routes, there is a chance that you reduce irregular migration and potentially with violations of human rights. Now, there are countries that we know, to Spain, for example, Morocco, to Middle East, Egypt, to Middle East, Yemen, and also you have like Libya, and in southern routes there are different other countries, and these are very important, so much so that because of the demand by partners like Europe and European countries and the European institutions, the countries that have key geographic proximity, potential chokehold on routes, they are highly demanded for cooperation by the European countries. And it encourages this special diplomacy, migration diplomacy, where financial aid and all instruments have become subservient to serve a migration objective of Europe. Even developmental aid or other kind of relations are traded, because diplomacy is a give and take, art and science, where these are merged. And some countries use it to increase their visibility in the system of international relationship. Then, of course, you have the policy and capability limitations of current migration governance structures in Africa, especially, but also in Europe and on those countries that are. And you see it happening from different perspectives. Not only that, many African countries sign agreements on migration without considering their capability, even for return and readmission, the capability, reintegration, that it simply imposes a lot of huge capacity issues. And when it's not a priority of that country, then priorities determine allocation of resources and budget. And there is no budget that is allocated from national system, then the countries has to struggle. And they may not have even a clear direction, policy direction. On migration, there is increasing capacity now on terms of policy, even some institutions, but on return readmission, especially reintegration, the limitation is huge. And this affects also the policy making, if you wish, because there are strict limitations. And the lobby by migration facilitators, in some cases traffickers, some cases registered employers, registered agencies that facilitate migration, but also smugglers and traffickers, they have huge impact on the policy making, most often at local level in terms of implementation of the policies that could seep into the policy making also in some cases, especially when you have a country that is extremely poor population and or economy, then the impact of the lobbying groups of different kind could have impact. And they are well connected. They do this one with other illegal contraband activities, and they have influence on, not immediately, but indirect influence on the policy making and implementation. The last one is the agenda, the Pan-African agenda of integration that has been there for long, long time. There is an interest to facilitate migration in Africa, within Africa. And recently, there was a proliferation of free movement agreements and protocols with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and related ones. And there is a bit on waiver of arrival, visa on arrival, but even abolition of visa is increasing. If you see the index by African Development Bank, you will see the trend is generally not fast as the agreement on trade of goods or mobility of goods, but on mobility of people also there. This affects also the policy making in terms of facilitating migration. Let me stop here, and later, if time permits, so that I don't eat the time of others, I will come back to some of the recommendations that I have identified in that paper later on. Linda, I end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mehari, for your presentation. It's very interesting to hear the different factors that you've listed. But in order not to do Amanda's job, I think I'll just introduce Amanda Bisong, Dr. Amanda Bisong, who is going to is the discussant of this paper. Amanda is a policy officer on migration and mobility related to AU and EU relations at the European Centre for Development and Policy Management. She has an impressive background working with GIZ as the head of trade and customs unit, managing an EU-funded project in the ECOWAS region. She has also worked in ECOWAS as in the Trade Directorate, the National Association for Nigerian Traders, and the Nigerian Bar Association. So you can see she has a lot of legal expertise that will actually give us some perspectives on Mehari's presentation. Her research focus has been on migration agreements, labor migration, linkages between trade and migration in Africa, as well as migration governance. I'm very interested to hear Amanda's perspectives on Mehari's paper, and it will be interesting to see whether we all share the different perspectives that you're going to raise. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Linda, for that interesting introduction. And thank you, Mehari, for inviting me to act as a discussant on this paper. So I'll try as much as possible to keep my points brief and concise so we can have enough time for discussions. I found the paper very interesting. Thank you, Mehari, for writing this paper and for giving me the opportunity to read and to discuss the paper. What I found particularly interesting about the paper is the fact that it brings together the different narratives that we've seen on African migration policy, migration governance and policy making. It brings together these different narratives in a very concise way and in a way that makes it easier to understand and read. So some of the points that had been raised, obviously in the paper, the discussions about migration and development, the discussions about remittances, these are things that we've seen, but as standalone narratives. But now in this paper, you present a very holistic overview of how all these different strands tie into migration policy making on the continent, not looking only at a particular region, not looking only at a particular country, but looking more broadly at how this affects the different layers. So not at the AU level, how these policies interact, these policy determinants interact and affect migration policy making at the AU level, for example, how they interact and affect migration policy making at the regional level. And we also see how they interact and affect migration policy making when it comes to the bilateral deals that are being made between countries. So I found it a very enriching paper, and I think that, in my opinion, I think this paper is really good in providing very good conceptual background to understanding what is going on when it comes to migration policy making in Africa in general. I mean, Mehari, you've always made the arguments that migration is not really a high priority issue for most African leaders, and it's becoming a high priority issue for African governments because of the emphasis that the EU places on this and the emphasis with regards to financial and technical support that is being given by European states towards African governments on the issue of migration. And in this paper, you clearly also bring out that point. We clearly see that in some countries, although migration is not a priority issue, it has eventually evolved into a priority issue, but there are other pressing issues at stake. For example, issues of conflict, issues of security, governance issues, larger issues that need to be addressed. However, migration is now rising up to the top of this agenda, this priority agenda, because of the emphasis that is being placed on migration by European partners and international organizations. These are some of the arguments you make, which I find really interesting, because these are things we say, but we don't write them. And now you've been able to write them in a very, very concise way. So I'll just briefly go through some of the main points in the paper that struck me. I think I've already said that it covers the whole gamut of African migration governance when it comes to what are really the key issues that drive African migration governance policy making, and you've managed to tease out these issues from the discussions, from policy documents, and you've been able to list them out in a very concise manner and weave a web of these determinants to show how really they translate into the policy making process. So for me, I think I found that really interesting. Another thing I found interesting was the fact that when we talk about development, especially migration and development, we also see the differing perspectives on development. So you just mentioned it now again in your presentation. When the EU talks about migration and development, they're looking at it from the perspective of addressing the root causes of migration. But we see also, when we look at the EU relevant documents on migration, at least up to a certain point, we see that the EU focused more on livelihoods and economic opportunities being made available to people, especially and also on remittances. So for me, I think it's this different perspectives of development that the African policymakers are looking at and European policymakers are looking at, but we're all speaking the same lingo. We're all saying, well, migration and development are intrinsically linked, but in the mindset of the policymakers, development means different things. And so the outcome of those policies are also related to what they understand or what they feel that development should mean in a particular sense. So I think I found that also really interesting. And also, you talked about the issue of irregular migration and poverty. And it's interesting the fact that the data that we increasingly see coming out shows that the people who migrate are actually not the poorest of the poor. So this brings into question some of the projects that have been funded by the EUTF that you also speak about in your paper, the role of the EUTF and the finances linked to the EUTF, and some of the European Trust Fund on Migration, which was a result of the Valletta Summit, and some of the projects that were funded under this really targeting, addressing the root causes of migration, addressing issues related to poverty with a view to reducing irregular migration. It brings into question some of these things, and you nicely also address them in the paper, saying, okay, if these are some of the issues, how do we resolve the issues relating to these questions around irregular migration and poverty, irregular migration and addressing the root causes of irregular migration. Now, another point that you made is relating to political regimes and the increasing cooperation with autocratic regimes and how this affects broader governance issues. I think it was really interesting to see how you made this point, because it's something that we've seen in the papers. It's something that we've seen in some policy papers, also in the newspapers. In some policy papers, we've seen civil society organizations calling out to governments to reduce their level of cooperation with autocratic governments. But here you clearly show the link in the paper, saying, look, the policy regimes affect the level of cooperation with the different governments that are in play in either in the African countries, or you also look at the governments in the destination countries. So I think somewhere in the paper you draw this distinction between what happens when you have returns from Middle East countries and Gulf Cooperation states, or what happens when you have returns, for example, from European countries, and the level also of implementation of human rights policies and how these affect the conditions under which these migrants are returned. So I find that equally interesting. However, for me, I think one of the questions that this issue of political regimes and cooperation with the EU raises also has to do with the issues of governance, because increasingly we see that one of the reasons, at least from studies and from the data, we see that one of the reasons why people equally choose to leave their countries of origin and migrate is linked to broader governance issues. And so for me, I think one of the main issues that this raises is if these governments are autocratic regimes and people choose to leave because they don't want to live in a country with an autocratic regime, and the EU is cooperating with these autocratic governments to get people to stay in their countries of origin, is this not some sort of duplicity? And how to resolve this issue? How can broader governance issues be addressed when we know from the data that governance issues are linked to why people choose to leave their countries of origin? Another point that you touched is the issue of financial gains, and not only for the financial incentives, not only for the countries of origin, but increasingly also now for international organizations and non-state actors. And I found that really interesting that you raised that in your paper. Thomas Spikemore, I think, has an interesting article on this that was published last year. And it also brings into perspective this issue of, okay, who is gaining from this discussion on migration governance in Africa? And is it really the national governments? Is it really the migrants who find themselves in better conditions? Is it the countries of destination who are now seeing reduced numbers of irregular migrants? Or is it international organizations and non-state actors who are benefiting from the plethora of resources available now on this issue of migration governance? And I think this is a question that really needs to be addressed and needs to be answered. And it's a point that you raise in your paper saying, well, this is one of the determinants also when it comes to migration policy making in Africa. And I found that really interesting. Yeah, again, the issue of diplomacy and using migrants as a tool in migration policy making. We see that also clearly in some African countries, and you make some examples there where migrants are used as a tool for migration diplomacy. We've seen how that has played out. And one of the questions, obviously, this raises is concerns around human rights and how the human rights of migrants are being respected, which is unfortunately one of the issues that we don't see frequently on the table being discussed when it comes to migration policy making. And you equally highlight this in your conclusions on the paper. I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to try and run as fast as possible. When it comes to geographic proximity, you make the point also about countries being closer to Europe geographically, playing a more key role, countries being placed on certain migration routes, playing a key role in terms of migration policy making. But one of the things that strikes me also, and this is another point that you make in the paper, is the fact that in grouping countries to address issues on migration, governance, the EU frequently ignores regional context or regional groupings and creates its own groupings that works along either certain routes or that works according to its own agenda in terms of reducing the flow of irregular migrants. So this is something that's equally striking. I mean, we've seen now recently, in recent times, some coordination between these existing groupings and other AU structures, which is good, which is a move in the right direction. However, we still see, in terms of allocating funds, breaking up of some of these regional groups, which, I mean, it would be ideal if we're working within geographical context to try and work within regional settings, because these have the same agenda when it comes to migration policy making. Last 2 points I think I've made the point on the role of international actors as beneficiaries from some of the financial incentives available, but also I think I need to make this point on the role of international actors when it comes to migration governance at the national levels, and the fact that some of these national national coordination mechanisms, which you mentioned in your paper, are equally driven by international actors because of the lack of capacity, which is another point you make in the paper. Because of the lack of capacity available at the national level, then we find that national coordination mechanisms on migration governance that are existing, national migration policies, for example, are drafted by international actors. So it raises the question of originality of some of these migration policies. And if the document is not original, then to what end? How will it be implemented by actors who have no idea what is even in the document and who do not have the capacity to implement it? What I found quite interesting in one of the fieldwork exercises I did was the fact that there exists in a certain country, there was a national coordination mechanism. However, the actual coordination on the ground was being done by international organizations. So I think it's a bit of, it's kind of like a tug and a bit of a question, but this is one of the issues that you also raise in the paper. I think I'll just, Linda, if I can have one more minute, just some few points on how I think that the paper can be strengthened a bit. I think it's possible for us now, the summit is upcoming, to review the section on EU-AU cooperation and possible ways for moving the discussion forward. I think a main point you make there is the issue of the research gap when it comes to legal pathways on migration and the possibility, how is this going to work out in terms of actual numbers, in terms of acting as an incentive. But I think another issue that really does deserve some attention is this issue around return, reintegration and readmission. The fact that governments are really being pushed into this. And what does this mean on the national level? What does this mean at the city level? What does this mean also for the migrants who are being forced to return? And the fact that voluntary return is now being loosely interpreted also by governments and by international actors, and some forms of coerced return are also being loosely now interpreted as voluntary return. I think this is also another issue that needs a lot of emphasis. And then, of course, the role of international organizations, I think that can be fleshed out a little bit, and equally the role of the private sector and the issues that these raises, especially since we see now that international actors and the private sector are taking up roles that naturally should have been state roles. So the states are ceding responsibilities to these actors, and it has implications in terms of human rights issues. So again, bringing back to the table the issue of the human rights of migrants and how these migrants are treated, especially since the states are now ceding out their responsibility, and not only African states, but also European states are ceding out responsibility on some of these issues in order to avoid being challenged, especially when the rights of migrants are breached. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for your interesting perspectives and food for thought. I'm sure Mehari is keeping them in mind, and also some of the people who are actually tuning in. If you have questions for Amanda, even Mehari, just to keep the conversation going, please put your questions in the chat box and we'll come back to you. And also Mehari's paper is available on the MPC website if you have not accessed it. And we can also make it available on the chat, I believe, on YouTube. In order to not take too much time, I think I would like to introduce Professor Maurizio Carbone, who is a professor at the University of Glasgow in international relations. Looking at his background, he seems to have worked on 3 different continents: in Glasgow, in the US, and I see the University of Pretoria. So he has a very impressive background looking at international relations and development and EU external policies. I will not go through his impressive record. What we'll do is we'll make his profile available to you on the website. And I would like to invite Maurizio to actually make his intervention, where he's going to focus on migration and the EU-Africa relations. Over to you, Maurizio.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to Mehari, also to Andrew Giddes, who facilitated this. And I have to say something before I start, because I'm not an expert on migration per se, but I'm an expert more or less, like my career has been on EU Africa relations more from the development point of view, and EU-ACP relations. And that's the what I'm going to cover today. So bear with me in case there are some overlaps with the presentation, because this is because I draw a lot on the papers written by Mehari, by Amanda, by people who have written extensively on migration. So the idea here is that, as I said, I'm going to discuss in particular the relations between the EU and the ACP states, or the Organization of Africa, Caribbean, Pacific States, which is the new name for the ACP group since 2020. So you will hear me using these terms interchangeably in the next 10-15 minutes. What I'm going to do is to present the gist of a paper which I've written on how migration policy has been dealt with in the post-Cotonou agreement. And as you may be aware, there is this new agreement which is yet to be signed by the EU and the OACPS, which has been initialed in April 2021, but is about to be signed sometimes soon. There are some technical problems about it, but soon it will be signed, probably in Samoa. It's not been decided yet, so there are some discussion how to call it, but for the moment we call it the EU-OACPS agreement. And when the starting point of my paper is essentially this. So I looked at the migration chapter of the post-Cotonou agreement, of the EU-ACPS agreement, and trace it, how this has been dealt with in the negotiations. And I look at the process and the outcome. But before I do that, I go back and I see, I look at the mandate, the EU mandate for the post-Cotonou, and I see one particular point, that the EU was extremely ambitious in what it wanted to achieve. In particular, it wanted to do the usual thing, a balanced approach, although there's been some transformation of the initial ideas of the European Commission put forward in the recommendation, including the idea of stemming irregular migration. But there was one particular ambition to adopt a specific mechanism for return and readmission. So if you look at this, I ask myself, let's wait for a second here. So let me try to understand, was this an easy task? No, in reality it was not, because if we look at how the ACP group has resisted EU pressure on a specific mechanism of return and readmission, which is one of the central problems in EU-African migration relations, this has been done already in 2000. And when you try to include a similar mechanism, this has been done in 2010 in the second revision of the Cotonou Agreement, and the ACP group resisted back then, despite the fact that the EU could use financial aid because the European Development Fund was part of the Cotonou Agreement. So the ACP resisted. So there was only a general provision stating that there was a commitment for ACP states to readmit their irregular citizens who were illegally present in the territory of one of the member states. So that's the first point. The second point is that the EU had for a long time tried to conclude bilateral return and readmission with African states, and it substantially failed. In particular, there was only one, I believe, with Cape Verde, but to the point that the EU had actually resorted to go to informal agreements with a number of different states. So failure also on that side. At the same time, we need to take into account the fact that there was a stronger agency of Africa and the African Union, which is also witnessed by the outcome of the Valletta summit, when also on that occasion, the US tried to insert again, to sneak in, as one of the persons who I interviewed told me, to sneak in a sort of, again, at the last moment, a provision, a mechanism of return or admission, and then not succeeded. So as you see, the task was, for the negotiator, was formidable, also because there was no financial protocol attached to the post-Cotonou agreement. So I look at this, the initial task, the initial ambition of the EU, and I see this difficult task, and then I see the outcome. The outcome is that there is a mechanism for return and readmission, which is in the main agreement, as well as in a dedicated annex with some stringent provision on return and readmission. And then some of my interviews told me that some of the member states said, we never expected such an outcome. This is so good for us. It may even, the importance of this, some of my interview told me that, look, if this is applied, we really don't need anything else in the future. We no longer need to continue the story with formal readmission agreements. This is enough, because it can be applied as such. And the same thing, the fact that this was surprising, and a surprising outcome was also in the fact that some NGOs Concord came out, complaining that there was much more stringent language on return readmission than in any other parts of the agreement. So the real question is, how do I explain this surprising outcome in New Africa EU-ACP migration cooperation? How can we explain this? In order to explain this, I have a little bit, I explain my methodology, process tracing. I was involved in a way, directly involved in the negotiations, and so I did a number of interviews after with all the protagonists of the negotiations. So this is what I try to explain. In order to do this, of course, I engage the conceptual framework of the paper. It is built around a series of three strands of the literature, in a way. One is the migration policy literature, and the migration governance, the migration diplomacy literature. One of my colleagues at the University of Glasgow has come out with this concept of migration diplomacy. The second element is the external dimension of EU migration policy, and of course we all are familiar with externalization of migration governance, and the 2 or 3 level games, depending how that game is how that metaphor is used. And then I came out with an idea, and I said, look, in reality, what is being played here is a sort of double 2-level game. So there are 2 games played simultaneously, but at the EU level and at the OACPS level. So it's not only, like, I don't see it only from the point of view of the European Union, but also I examine the games played by the OACPS at the OACPS level. And in order to do this, of course, I have to rely on the literature, on the external dimension of EU migration policy. And of course, the work on Mehari has been quite influential in this, like other work, because there's been a renewed interest in the concept of migration governance, and how third countries affect EU policy, of course. So the empirical case, as you see, as I was discussing, is the post-Cotonou agreement, and I unpack the negotiations, and in particular, I look at the migration chapter, which occupies, as you know, migration is one of the 6 priorities of the post-Cotonou agreement. It's not only one article, famous Article 13, but actually now is one of the 6 strategic priorities, and development is one of them. So the ambition is, the rhetoric is to go beyond development. So and then you have this unprecedented framework, which is a general, but we don't need to discuss this, which is a general framework plus 3 regional protocols. But the specific elements of the migration, the negotiation, the specifics of the migration chapter is that there are essentially 2 phases in the negotiation of this chapter. 2 phases. A first phase, which is discussed essentially at the beginning of 2019, and in which you have a very smooth process, in which the 2 parties negotiate around 5 issues built around the Valletta summit, like the 5 dimensions. Although it was decided to separate return, readmission, reintegration from irregular migration, because since the beginning there was a clear understanding that there was going to be controversial, essentially because the ACP, the only element there was no match on migration in the ACP mandate. And if you look in some of the interviews which I've conducted, reassure me or told me that the only objective that they had, and probably this is one of the weaknesses of their approach, was the fact that they did not add a broader understanding, or they were not ambitious enough on migration, because they understood that the only task at hand for them was to reject a sort of a unilateral approach that the EU was pursuing migration. So when there was the second phase, what concerned, so that was the first phase. I can come back to this point, but I want to concentrate on the return and readmission chapter, which was extremely controversial. And in fact, there was a very visible, in terms of discussion between the EU and the ACP, and the potential area of contentions were essentially 3 or 4, where the EU was extremely aggressive on some of these points, aggressive in terms of promoting its offensive interests. Also because the mandate was quite clear, and the issue at stake where the idea of readmission without conditionality and any formalities other than the verification process. So, as you know, the cooperation of the recipient countries is key. And that's one of the complaints that the ACP has put on the table, one of the complaints made by you about the entire process of readmission, that African states do not cooperate because they have not much interest. And Mehari in his paper, and Amanda as well, have documented this. So in reality, if migration is not incredibly politicized, although much more than we generally believe, much more than it generally believed, is in all other states except in West Africa, for a number of reasons which are clear, because of the remittances, because of the cost of returnees, of reintegrated returnees. So, and the fact that political opposition can create problems to governments who accept bilateral, who accept readmission agreements. The other contentious issue was around the use of EU travel documents. The EU wanted to use EU travel documents in case there was it was clear, well, from the EU's point of view, that a person was from a specific country. Of course, the ACP rejected that view, because they perceived it as a sort of violation of national sovereignty. The other point where the European Union tried to push hard was on the fact that the ACP states had to respond very quickly to return requests by the EU member states. And the EU wanted to have a very strict deadlines. And a number of ACP states resisted that, because they said they would not have the capacity to deal with the return request so swiftly. And in particular, what they argue at the end, and they managed to have in the final agreement, was the fact that the deadline was nothing else but what is already in international agreements. In the International Civil Aviation, the Convention on the Chicago Convention. So in reality, it's something that the ACP had already adopted. The only element, you see how the EU was pushing very strongly on all these elements. At the end, the ACP managed to counter the EU proposal. And the only element where, in a certain way, there was some, like where you, when you achieved something which was in the negotiation mandate, is in the so-called procedure for breach of obligation. What does it mean? That in reality, whenever a country does not respond so quickly, the EU can initiate a process which may result in the application of appropriate measures, or the way it is called, not appropriate measure, I can clarify this if there are questions, of proportionate measures. So in a way, that's something linked in a way to the famous Article 96 of the former Cotonou Agreement. So if we look at all these elements, we realize what's there. So you have a detailed provision with stringent language, but at the same time, the ACP say, well, in reality, we do not agree, we do not go much beyond what was already international negotiation. So that's why we need to have a nuanced view of the outcome, because this has been celebrated, as I told you, by a major success for the EU, as member states have been incredibly happy. The NGOs have protested because of stringent language. At the end, not much beyond what already the ACP have agreed internationally has been agreed upon, actually. Now, how do I explain that? So can I say, how do I explain this still unexpected outcome? Can we discuss it and then use the asymmetrical process in EU-ACP negotiations, which has characterized EU-ACP relations? I challenge that expectation. I can come back to this point in the Q&A. I also challenge the view that there was a sort of transactional approach to EU-ACP agreement. And the migration literature, the migration diplomacy literature is full of this, of the use of side payments. I challenge that. And then I argue that what really counts is the fact that the two negotiators managed to construct, and I use that term willingly, managed to construct a common win set, and that's why we have the two-level game, which in a way which satisfied both the EU and EU-ACPs without crossing red lines. So it's a sort of constructivist approach to migration cooperation, to migration diplomacy, because so far migration diplomacy has used more a rationalist explanation. So, of course, I say that the context matters because the context matters because some people may argue that there is more collusion than cooperation between the EU and the ACP states. I may come back to the question at the Q&A session. I argue that this time negotiations were different from previous occasions. And they were not as asymmetrical as they were in previous occasions, also because, let's not forget, aid was not part of the discussion, trade was not part of the discussion, if not minimally. So the negotiations were less asymmetrical than previous circumstances, than previous occasions. That doesn't mean that there was not a north-south divide on these issues. The other element that we need to take into account is the clash between the EU and the ACPs, because the EU has developed a significant agency in this area and has a clear view of what to achieve in migration, but the AU, the African Union, because of a number of clashes between the EU and the ACPs, did not participate in the negotiations as it was expected at the beginning. So the other element that we need to take into account, something that Mehari was touching upon and Amanda touched upon, is the fact that the ambassadors in Brussels, the African ambassadors in Brussels, were delinked from national capitals, which in a way were less subject to domestic pressures. That may be problematic, which is a problem that the developing countries face in international negotiations. Final point is about a sort of negotiation fatigue. The most recalcitrant state about this mechanism were essentially the West African states, but they were kind of a sort of pressure in a way, although I'm not contradicting myself with the argument, by not just by the EU, which the so-called new normal, Andrew Giddes has talked about this, the new normal, they understood that there was a new normal about migration in the European Union. So they understood that the EU negotiator had to come up with a solution, had to come up with try to find a solution on this important problem of return and readmission. So, and at the same time, there were other countries like the Pacific and the Caribbean, which were not so much interested in this discussion. So someone may argue that being in a larger forum, like I'm finishing, Linda, being a larger forum like the EU-ACPs was kind of penalized the West African states, rather contrary to the fact that if they were able to negotiate bilaterally. Okay, so this is generally a gist of the argument of the paper. So there are more things in the paper, but I stop here.
Okay, thank you so much, Maurizio. I know there's a lot to unpack. This is quite a large conversation. It cannot be done in an hour, 15 minutes. Maybe we can negotiate next time for a longer discussion. But there are a couple of questions that have come up on the chat. So I would want to balance the questions so that Mehari is not overwhelmed. First, let me just start with a question to Amanda, and it's a question about the legal pathways. There seems to be much talk about legal pathways, but there's a substantive basis, actual proposals, examples for discussion between AU and EU, with the likelihood, what is the likelihood of the practical outputs on that? And then maybe I can ask you to also answer another question, and maybe Mehari can come in and give his perspectives on, sorry, just one second. on free movement agreements across the continent. What are the prospects of such agreements being ratified and become operational? We'll start with those questions, and I'll come to you, Mehari, with the three questions that have been targeted towards you. Amanda?
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the questions. On the role of legal pathways, I think we've seen in the last couple of years, at least in the last 5 years, as a result of the trust fund and several other funds made available at the EU level, we've seen a rise in the number of pilot projects around legal pathways. Some of these using existing labor mobility pathways that are in EU member states. Of course, when it comes to labor migration, the competence is at the level of the EU member states. And so, although the EU does provide a framework within which member states can work, within which member states can have these agreements with other African countries, the negotiations are usually on a bilateral level. So we've seen a couple of pilot projects increasingly over the last couple of years, some between Belgium and Morocco, Belgium and Nigeria, Lithuania and Nigeria, and very interesting projects. I think one of the main issues around this project is with regards to scale. So how many people can benefit from some of these pilot projects? I know that the ICT project between Lithuania and Nigeria, you have plus or minus 20 people who benefited from the first phase of that. I think it's called Digital Explorers. You have like 20 people who benefited from the first phase of that. They're now in the second phase, and we're looking at another set of people who will equally benefit from the second phase. But again, it's a question of numbers. And I think the discussions are also around how to scale up some of these pilot projects, which are very cost intensive. And in some cases, I think the pilot projects just act as an incentive to have discussions around return and reintegration. Last year, we saw the talent partnerships, or 2 years ago, we saw talent partnerships being introduced as one of the new tools by the EU to achieve some sort of movement on the front of legal pathways and promoting labor mobility. However, these talent partnerships need to be negotiated also on a bilateral level between EU member states and third countries. But what I think, I don't think there has been any successfully negotiated yet. I think the process of negotiating is still ongoing, also because the framework for the talent partnerships were just fleshed out late last year. But some of the points that are interesting around these legal pathways and their use is the fact that we increasingly see these bilateral agreements between EU member states and countries of origin that attack priority countries. So these are countries of origin, either with large number of irregular migrants residing within the EU or transit countries. So they act kind of like as an incentive again to promote discussions on returns and readmissions, which Maurizo has spoken about and is also in the paper by Harry. I think another interesting thing that we're seeing in some of these new generation legal pathway pilot projects, because they have been pilot projects that have existed over the years, but one interesting thing we're seeing in this new generation of pilot projects is the inclusion of various stakeholders. So where previously it would just be a discussion between the governments and you don't see a lot of stakeholders involved in it. Now in this new generation in this new generation labor mobility agreements, some of them based on the global skills partnership, which is referred to in the Global Compact on Migration. In some of these agreements, you see an involvement of a broader range of stakeholders. So you have the private sector involved, training institutions involved, labor agencies and labor unions also involved in it, which is making it more broader and richer, but also poses a task with regards to coordination of these different actors. So there are some examples. There are some. I think for these last phase of pilot projects, some of them are already releasing some evaluation reports that we can look into to see. But also, I think one of the main issues is the issue of skill. With regards to free movement on the continent, I think Harry mentioned it in his presentation, and it's also in the paper that you see a plethora of free movement agreements on the continent. However, the issue is with the implementation of some of these agreements. And I think he also mentioned the fact that there is the EU Free Movement Protocol, which was adopted on the same day as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. However, while the Continental Free Trade Agreement is kicking off and has been ratified by a record number of countries, the protocol on free movement has been ratified by only 4 countries, signed by a lot more, but ratified by only 4, and we need 15 ratifications for it to come into force. So that's one of the main issues that's holding back the discussions on that. I think I have written some things around the free movement, and I think Mehari has also written a lot of things around the free movement protocols and their implementation on the continent. So that'd be interesting to look into. I think Mehari in his paper also makes this argument about the EU's support for bilateral agreements undermining the free movement agendas on the continent, which is very valid and which we've seen in practice. And he makes the argument convincingly in the paper. Yeah. Oops. Okay, I think we've lost Linda.
Yeah.
So maybe
let me make Amanda. In the meantime, that Linda comes back, we may have lost her. Just a point which I want to highlight about what you were saying in the way, again, sorry to bring back to the post-Cotonou agreement, which plays an important role, much more than, because this is, let's remember, it's not just an agreement with the ACP, it's an agreement with 79 member states of the ACP. So it's an association agreement between the EU and 79, so individual, so it can be an individual association agreement, like the one that we have with Algeria, the one with Egypt. So there are 79, and one of the elements that you had in this agreement, it says they shall work to develop and use legal pathways for migration, including labor migration and other mobility schemes, taking into account national priority and labor market needs. You see how this is negotiated, the language that has been used, and if we look at process tracing in different drafts, I can tell you how each word was used, and exactly what you were saying, that here we have to look at bilateral elements, because there was a major division between the EU member states on that specific paragraph, because the labor needs and the national priorities completely differ on this aspect. So that's important, and that's what you say. They shall work to develop. So it's something where they understood that there was at EU level, there was not the climate to go. It was no longer the climate to have to have a new opening on legal pathways, at least at the continental level, if I may use EU level in that sense, involving all member states. Linda, you're back.
Thank you so much for covering for me. In fact, I want to invite you to answer a question here on pathways on I don't know if you're the right person to answer, but maybe you can contribute. But I'll pass the question to Mehari first, and then you can comment afterwards. There are many pathways to the EU, such as the Talent Partnership, which are bilateral. How pleased should we be about these partnerships? Should they be conducted between the EU and regional blocs rather than bilaterally? It will be interesting to hear both perspectives. And then just another question that was raised earlier, is there any correlation between migrant return pressures, for example, the EU and recent coups? Do you see a pressure increase and policy change post-coup, especially in some of the countries in West Africa that have been having these coups? So maybe let's start with those 2 questions, and I'll come back to the other 2 questions that have been asked. Over to you, Mehari and Maruti. You're on mute, Mehari.
Thank you, Linda. Sorry for that. Thank you, Linda. And Amanda, also Mauricio, for the points that you have raised and the questions from the participants. First, on the coup, I can only make 2 points. I cannot respond to the question directly. The reason being that we are yet to see evidence if this has direct bearing. From what I know, and I follow the peace and security situation in this country for a long time, these countries, including on coup d'etats. And we had 9 coup d'etat attempts in the past 2 years. 2 coup d'etats and coup d'etat attempts. And in this, 6 has succeeded. But suffice to say, the main reason has been actually more has to do with the quality of election, the quality of democratic institutions in these countries, whether they are able to stand. It's about the resilience of these institutions to stand with shocks of different kinds, including the democratic civilian control of armed forces, the control of civilian control of armed forces rather than anything else. So it has come back again and again to the quality of democratic institutions, strengths, check and balance, whether the military other. And the second factor has been, again, frequently cited factor is the role of external actors in general. Whether this role of external actors, in this case, actually, Russia and the US are the ones which are mentioned repeatedly in write-ups, but in general, competition of great powers has contributed to some of the imbalance. But there are other shocks also related to socioeconomic aspects, the pandemic, economic fall down, free fall. Most of these countries have, their economies are in free fall, if you wish. Sudan, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, they have serious economic problem, or Niger, or the recent attempts in different countries of attempted coup d'etats. So whether indirectly maybe remittances, the lack of remittances, or the pressure on the government could contribute. But this is a wild guess. I can't really answer directly whether there is a correlation between the two. So there are myriads of factors, but the main factor seems to be about the quality of the institutions themselves. I can exchange some documents that I have with whomever is interested on that. On the issue of pathways, it's like the legal pathways is like waiting for Godot. It's just never to arrive. We are waiting. We are waiting. Amanda likes to talk about that, so I'm fine with that. But I'm waiting. It's really a rehashing of previous efforts that has been there, and it applies to Northern Africa. Few Northern African countries. The other African countries is peanut, that it doesn't really come as a big mechanism of addressing the lopsided effort on irregular migration, and then containing migration in general in Africa, but at the same time allowing some safety valve to allow skilled people to migrate on specific area. We are yet to see it. We are yet to see it. There is more actually action on return and readmission and reintegration. There is more action. There is movement. It's kicking. That partnership area is actually alive and kicking, unlike the pathways. I think the pathways is bilateral, extremely bilateral, or too much bilateral, if you wish. I don't know what it means, but generally speaking, we are yet to see that. And we are yet to see two aspects: the number, whether there will be enough skilled base, because this is bilateral, this is skill-based, it's demand-driven mainly. And then the demand-driven supply side has to be ready there. The supply side of skilled labor meeting the demand side is yet to be there. And the capacity building issue, that the capacity limitation we raised, is still there. There is a lot of work to be done. So I think we are going to be on long waiting unless there is a huge pressure from the European side really to speed up this one. And European Commission and the European institutions can play a big role in pushing this one faster. And we see the key role African migrants from different countries could play in filling some of the gaps in the labor demand that countries have. But we are yet to see it, I think, the detail. The last point I want to raise is on the free movement agreements. It's clear that there is overall support from the public at large in Africa for free movement, huge support. And for the first time, that support is also backed up by political leadership in general. There is hype to support those. Of course, ultimately, the implementation will be the most important thing. It's an implementation issue, not only a declaration of free movement protocols. The ratification is slow, but I don't think it will be difficult to get enough number to allow the entry of these protocols into force. But ultimately, I think laws are like traffic lights. If you don't implement them, they don't work. We have seen before. So these protocols will have to be implemented, and implementation will depend on various aspects, including European Union's support to that. European Union has been supporting, by the way, some of the free movement protocols and processes. What is the problem is what it's supporting with one hand is denying also with the other hand, because there is incoherence of interventions. You support free movement, but there are more of hardening of borders because of the intervention European Union is making. It's hardening it. Even in areas where you have informal cross-border trade, now papers are important. These people didn't know papers. They knew each other. And so now papers are being required because it has seeped into the European Union system, has seeped into national systems. Airports in Kenya, in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, and elsewhere, you have additional checks apart from the sovereign country's check of immigration. There are additional checks on visas on the airports. It's hardening the border, and it increases the restrictions, or at least barriers or obstacles to more free movement within Africa. So I think there is a need to avoid capacity substitution, where instead of building the capacity of the country, in some cases you have substitution of the capacity by appointing migration liaison officers, this and that, in ports. So I think a lot has to be done on that synergy. I understand there was knee-jerk reaction from European side because of what is called crisis in 2015, and the European Commission institutions has to show something that they are doing something to member states. They are under pressure. So the knee-jerk reaction has led to this kind of situation. But I think it's very important to be more grounded, reflect on the reality, and speed up on some of the things that has been left behind, or not all parts of the partnership are being practiced. Some muscles are more exercising more than others, and those that are not being used are becoming feeble, in my opinion, including the legal pathways, but the free movement arrangement. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much, Mehari. I think you kind of answered the question that I was going to reserve for the next segment. I would like to hear actually Maurizio's perspectives on what you just said, maybe just an expansion from his perspective.
Yeah,
Amanda, please feel free to also step in when you want.
Just a couple of things to what I already said when you were away, Linda. One of the things that surprised me, again, I take, as I said, I only look at the negotiation of this EU-ACP agreement, because in particular I'm writing a book for Oxford University Press on this specific topic. And one of the things that surprised me was the fact that the Hungary, let's name it, takes the blame for being very strong, for being very aggressive on return readmission. At the same time, when I saw the negotiation of the mandate, and I was in the ACP working party, I did not see much of a reaction from the more progressive states on countering that new narrative with a different narrative. So in a way, everybody was kind of hiding behind Hungary. Maybe they did not like the language which was used by Hungary, but everybody was comfortable with the emphasis on return admission. At the same time, what I'm trying to say here, going back to the legal migration aspect, that there were no states which were saying, let's okay, fine to have this strong language on return admission, but let's expand opportunities for let's create more legal pathways. So let's give a different kind of answer. Let's be strong on the one side, but like have a more liberal policy on the other side. No, there was nobody doing that kind of building a different narrative. So that's one element which I want to say. At the same time, the other element which is very important is also that I was also surprised not to see much more. I don't know why I'm using this term a lot today. Like ACP states or African states themselves not being aggressive enough on pushing for legal migration. So kind of using the you want more this, but you need to give me something else. So there was not even that kind of diplomatic engagement, diplomatic attempt by the ACP. In a way, they were in a certain way, I would say they were kind of accepted the fact that they had to minimize the cost of having an agreement on return admission, which was the only reason to have a migration chapter for the EU. And in fact, you see how the language was softened and the idea of national competence, which was what I was saying earlier about the migration governance, the national sovereignty versus the managerial approach to migration governance. So, and Sam, if you want to read a very nice paper on, besides the Mehari paper, on how the European Union has undermined regional efforts in Africa, I'll invite you to read, if you have not done so, Amanda's paper on how the European Union has undermined the ECOWAS free movement of regional integration effort. So that's a very nice paper, which I invite you to read. I stop here.
Okay, thank you so much, Maurizio. I think the MPC will also make a link available to Amanda's paper. It's a very interesting paper to read. Amanda, do you have any interventions that you'd like to make based on the questions or even reactions to what Mehari and Maurizio have said?
I think reactions to what has been said. What another point I find interesting from the paper is this discussion about containment on the continent and how it's linked to free movement agendas. So interestingly, and Mehari, you teased that out nicely in your paper, in the narratives, you see that free movement is being pushed as an alternative to one of the alternatives to address the issue of irregular migration. Okay, allow free movement of people on the continent in a bid to reduce the number of people that migrate irregularly out of the continent, which I think is a very skewed, in my opinion, is a very skewed narrative, but it's something that you find out there, and it's something that you equally raise in the paper. And like you said, one of the issues around this is the policy incoherence that we see from the side of the EU, because we see that on the one hand, the EU is supporting free movement agendas at regional levels and at the continental, at the EU level, and the EU is also supporting this hardening of borders. So it's kind of like contradicting contradictory, what's going on the bilateral level and what's going on the regional and continental level. Worrying also is the fact that some of these measures to undermine these free movement agendas, or some of these measures to undermine continental protocols, have resulted in a lessening of the protection that's available for people who are moving on the continent. And like you said, also, Mehari, it's something that we've seen from my background in trade, is also something that I'm well aware of, the fact that informal cross-border traders now need to have additional costs. So in addition to the cost of moving goods across the continent or across the region or from one state to another, they now have additional costs when it comes to showing their immigration status or migration papers, or having papers necessary for them to cross borders, even if it's just for 24 or 48 hours, even if it's just to go to market. And these were provisions that, I mean, most of the free movement protocols already made provisions for these kinds of crossings of people who live in border areas or of cross-border traders. But we're seeing now a hardening of these borders when it comes to these people moving, and it creates a lot of in addition to the logistical challenges, it creates a lot of additional costs for traders who have to move. Also a lot of costs for seasonal workers who have to move. But I think, and another thing that was raised in the paper is this issue of lowering of standards. And I think it's really important that we I think maybe also in the research gaps, it's important that we address this by raising a lot of awareness also through our works and through our publication on this issue of lowering of standards, because it's quite disturbing that at the AU level you have a certain amount of protection that is afforded to migrants, to refugees, to asylum seekers, but as a result of the implementation of certain bilateral agreements, or as a result of the implementation of certain informal agreements now, then you see a lot of breaches when it comes to the implementation of these AU frameworks, which I think is worrying. Mehari, in your paper, you speak of some sort of de facto containment, and I find that really interesting. Also, the fact that things that the EU tried to agree with AU member states, and I mean, in the case of outsourcing the processing of asylum seekers, that the EU clearly made its statement on that flat out. It was not interested in that, in outsourcing asylum procedures. However, we see it, and you made a point about it, de facto it's creeping in through the back door through a series of informal agreements, through the role or the use of private actors and non-state actors. We see that outsourcing creeping in through the back door. So these are things that also need to be in the know, and you make these points in the paper. I think you flesh them out a bit more because they really need to show that these are some of the issues that go into African migration governance policy making.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for your perspectives, and I believe you answered a question that I was about to raise. So by way of wrapping up, maybe I'll ask Mehari to take the last question and probably also bring in his recommendations that he wanted to make in his presentation. So the last question is, are there any determinants on policy making in Africa that stand out with regard to technology uptake? And maybe you can actually mesh that with some of the recommended approaches that you would want us to think about going forward. And I'll also ask maybe Amanda and Maurizio to have like 1 or 2 points on their recommendations going forward for the summit ahead.
Thank you, Linda. I think on the technological uptake in general, I'm not expert, so I am not going to delve into that. Generally speaking, the trend is a lot of reform being introduced in immigration departments in Africa, with the potential capacity to, of course, capacitating these institutions to do their job. But there are huge discussions that I know in some Western African countries. They have succeeded very well in tailoring this technology and programs to fit their purpose. but in others, they are being duplicated without peculiarizing, let me put that word, or adjusting them to the peculiar needs and demands and realities of each country that want to adopt those technologies. Still, I think there is huge challenge. I only encourage you to look at the recent meeting by IOM in Berlin, the Data Hub, which organized on data in general. But technology was one of the aspects that was discussed. Since I don't have the detailed expertise, I don't want to take more time on this, but I encourage you to visit. I hope I will check the link maybe and pass it. But it's very important to look at whether many of the African countries are able to choose technology that is fit, or actually even contract out companies to make a tailor-made technology that fits their demand. There is huge capacity problem there with significant challenges. I don't know whether this address, but I'm just mentioning. There was a recently discussion though on this issue with the Berlin Migration Hub. There was a small contribution on the technology from Western Africa countries, how they are adapting some of the technologies to serve on migration issues, data collection, data management related to migration. And this includes to immigration authorities, but also regional entities. In terms of the recommendations, I think they are the usual, so I don't want to take more time because I think we have limited time, Linda, but I can share some of these, the slide itself. And they are there in the paper. I think the issue of partnership having a compass, a human rights compass, a moral compass, a value compass is very important. Look at the discussion we are having now and the discussion we have on migration. Most of them are devoid of human rights discussion of migrants. You don't find it. I mean, a few years ago, human rights was at the center of the discussion. There was a lot of effort to undermine that kind of debate. And we are now, I mean, it's about the number, statistics, or and the human cost of migration policies from Europe or African countries is not taken into account. Many African countries are not taking responsibility, and the responsibility seriously to their nationals and the nationals from African countries. Neither are Europeans also doing more. They have the capacity to do, but they are actually looking the other way in dealing with this. And the human rights issue still is a black hole, in my opinion, in these partnerships. And this extends, by the way, not to Europe only, to Middle Eastern countries. The deportation, the treatment of migrants, you know, at the center should have been human rights issue, but it's not. In some aspects, there is even tampering the core principle, jus cognus norm of migration regime in general, the non-refoulement principle are being affected seriously. There is tampering with that. There is a tendency to touch it. And that is, I think, very concerning in that. I'm not saying countries should not pursue their interest, but interests has to be tamed by human rights and international law clearly. And I think it's if institutions with historical pedigree of protecting human rights and being based on value system are not doing enough, others are not expected to do, where there is huge lacuna, in my opinion. The issue of return, readmission, and reintegration. There is a lot of pressure for deporting or for countries to receive even the people that they are not confirming their nationals. They are not forced. They shouldn't be forced. there is no legal obligation for them to accept. But some countries are being forced, and it's well known because they don't have this, the power to sustain this kind of pressure. And I think it's critical, and it's going to come more reinforced if we don't deal with those kind of things. We have also other issues on the legal pathways. We have to take the current profile of potential irregular migrants. If we were to address legal pathways as if we were to take legal pathways as silver bullet or even bronze bullets, many bronze bullets, basically, that address some part of the problems of irregular migration, we have to look if it's matches with the potential profile that we have about potential irregular migrants. I very much doubt. I call in the paper for further research on this because I am not yet fully sure. But the profile of potential irregular migrants, if you see, and those that can be addressed through legal pathways, there is mismatch as we speak. And that mismatch has to be addressed if we were to use legal pathways as one instrument of addressing irregular migration. Last one is dialogue. Dialogue has been missing. There is monologue, a lot of monologue, and there is a need for that. I am happy that the last Kigali Declaration and the summit between AU and EU foreign ministers have addressed this one and has included as a recommendation for the next partnership. And I hope there will be further dialogue where all could be the starting point for trust building, confidence building, and also measures could be done with more sober, not knee-jerk reaction to crisis, but with more sober discussion that can be imbued in the system of cooperation or partnership. Let me stop here, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your recommendations and insights. And anyone who wants to read his paper, it's on the MPC website. Just invite Maurizio and Amanda to make their last 1 minute comments that they would want to leave the delegates with, so we can have food for thought, but we'll share all the material online on the website. I don't know who wants to go first, Maurizio?
Yeah, we'll leave the floor to Amanda because she can wrap up better. I have one point which I want to highlight, and which I agree, of course, with Mehari, is the fact that I was also surprised that I was happy that Mehari said there is a lot of happening in the issue of reintegration. I did not see much because the third R in the RRNR has been dealt. If you look at the agreement, I was shocked by the amount of zero discussion which was happening during the negotiation. But the last point which I want to make, if there is somewhere where this agreement can have a potential impact for the future, I'm not saying groundbreaking, is the fact, besides what I just told you about the return and readmission agreement, which can be used as such, there's only one element where for the first time ever, the EU makes a link, start making a link between migration and environment in a legally binding agreement, migration and environment, and migration and climate change. Not as much as we could expect, but at least there's some reference, and at least it can be used to build on, because you take into account the nexus between migration, natural disaster, climate change, and environmental degradation, and can take actions to take it for the internally displaced person caused by climate change. Something that the ACP can kind of pocket for future cooperation in this particular area, for future project, etc. So there's something to watch for the future. It's not a recommendation, but at least something to watch for the future.
Thank you so much, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks, Mauricio, for making this point on migration, climate change, and the environment. Because for me, it was one of the recommendations I was going to point towards to say, okay, look, yes, there are these traditional issues that we have been talking about, but then there are also issues that definitely need to be addressed. And of course, the nexus between migration, climate change, and the environment being one of the key issues, again, brings me back to this point of on AU frameworks being ignored, because if we look through AU documents, we realize that the AU documents were one of the first to highlight the issue of people being displaced as a result of environmental crisis, or as a result of environmental crisis right from the 60s. So it's good to see that there is a move on this also on the front of the EU and OACP new post-Cotonou agreement on migration. I think that this issue of migration, environment, and climate change is really important, because it's one of the areas where we will still see a lot of displacement going on the continent, and further movement as a result of the displacement. Another issue is the issue of digitization that was raised. I think this is also another point where we need to see a lot of cooperation on, not only with regards to how these technological solutions are created and used, but also with regards to ethics, with regards to standards, with regards to the privacy of data, with regards to interlinking some of these systems, and who has the sovereignty over the data that is being generated. Because of course we're seeing a lot of biometric systems being used in countries on the continent, especially in African countries, with regards to processing of asylum seekers on the continent, with regards to also some refugee solutions, using a lot of using a lot of biometric solutions. So we need to really work on the standards. We need to work on the ethics. It's not just about introducing these technological solutions, but like Mehari said, it's about tailoring them to the needs and the realities of the different contexts, and also importantly about ethics standards and the data privacy, and who actually this data belongs to, and how it can be shared and how it can be used. I think last point I'd like to make is on the role of diaspora and remittances. I think Mehari made this point on remittances in the paper, but again, in the discussions now, especially with regards to the summit, we see that diaspora and the remittances, diaspora generally is not featured so far, at least in the discussions leading up to the summit, and of course the diaspora is a really key part of African migration governance, and they equally play a role in policy making on migration, not only by the remittances but also by the skills that they are able to share, and also by their contributions both to the society, both to their host societies and their societies, communities of origin. So I think it's really important that we again re-emphasize the role of the diaspora and their contributions, not only because they link to government interests, to government agendas, but because this key issue about development, right, which was the first point Mehari made, the migration and development being intrinsically linked, diaspora really features in these discussions. So it's important that we bring the diaspora discussions back to the table. I think I'll just leave it at this, and thank you very much for inviting us to speak. In Mehari, thank you, and Linda.
Amanda, and interesting enough, the African Charter on Human People's Rights contains the right to environment and the right to development, while those rights are not in the EU documents as rights, these third generation rights, which is something which is particularly striking for me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I know this conversation can go on, and I think it's going to go on as of next week with the AU-EU summit I believe it's next week, right? But on my part, thank you so much for your participation, your engagement. This has been an interesting dialogue, and I'm sure we'll have follow-up webinars on this. The MPC will obviously advertise the next webinar session on their website and on their Twitter page. But on my part, I would like to thank Professor Geddes and his team at the MPC for the invitation, and the speakers for their intervention. So thank you so much for listening in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Linda.
everybody.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.